hello, and welcome again to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast and TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. If you'd like to contact us with ideas, suggestions, etc., just feel free to email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. As you know, this is no secret. We are in the midst of rather interesting times of great transition and hopefully some transformation. There are so many issues that affect us as a community, and especially those of us of a certain age, that we decided to welcome Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who is the director of the Union of Reform Judaism's Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., to welcome Rabbi Pesner to our Seekers of Meaning today to really talk a little bit about some of the great social justice issues that are impacting us, and by definition are going to impact our children and most definitely our grandchildren. So, Jonah, and for full disclosure, we've known each other for a while and have worked together. So, Jonah, welcome. It's a real pleasure, and I thank you for taking some time out of what I know is a very, very busy schedule down in Washington for you to join us. So thank you. First of all, how are you? How's the family? I hope everybody's well.
Thank God everybody is doing fine, and it's an honor to be on the podcast. I'm glad I finally aged into it. Really appreciate it. I've been waiting a long time, Richie Address, to be part of the Sacred Aging family. So
you're the first person to finally have aged into it. It's
no, listen, I've been wanting to be part of this for a long time.
I'll have to write that down.
I'm sure your followers know you've been a leader of the Reform movement for a long time. So we really just appreciate everything you've done and continue to do to make our Jewish community and our broader society more just and whole. I'll say my life is great. I have 4 beautiful daughters. One just graduated from college. Thank you. I have 2 more who finished their freshman year. So I know later you're going to talk about everything that's been happening on campuses. I have a focus group. I was a visiting scholar at Harvard University in the fall when things blew up. So we have 4 people on campuses. We have what to talk about.
Before we do that, before we jump right into the campus thing, because I do want to ask you to talk about it real quickly. There may be a couple of people left. They have been stuck at a ball game, extra innings, and they just don't know what the rack is. Real fast, introduction to the Religious Action Center, briefly.
Yeah, sure. So, it's a great story, Richie, as you know. Kivi Kaplan, who is our founder, great philanthropist for the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the URJ, who was a Boston Jew, child of immigrants, came to this country with nothing, became a successful businessman, and then a very generous philanthropist. He donated the rack to our movement, but the backstory was incredible. He was in Florida on his honeymoon during the Jim Crow era with his amazing wife, Emily. They experienced a sign they had never seen coming from the Northeast: no Jews, no dogs. And they turned to the black taxi driver who was driving them around and asked, what is this? Is this common down here? And the African-American driver said, they don't even bother with us. And Kivi understood then that Jim Crow, the oppression of blacks in America, was about the oppression of all minorities. And that, as Dr. King used to say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He became the president of the NAACP. He was the last white Jewish president of the NAACP, which in its origins was white Jews and black Christians mostly. And he donated the embassy-sized building that we occupy in DuPont Circle to the Reform movement, but with one stipulation. He said you have to be a hub for civil rights activity, which is why our founder, and we'll talk about him in a minute, the amazing Rabbi Dick Hirsch, called, as soon as he got into his new offices in Washington, his dear friend, a young, charismatic pastor named Martin, and said, Martin, good news, you have an office in Washington. Which is why King used our offices. The luminaries of the civil rights movement, the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, used to be in our offices for decades, which is why the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in our conference room. And we don't just sit on nostalgia, as you know, Richie. For nearly 6 decades or more, Rabbi David Saperstein, who carried the torch from Rabbi Dick Hirsch, led our movement to be at the forefront of campaigns for LGBTQ equality, women's rights, Israel advocacy, combating antisemitism, and beating back bigotry in all forms. And it's an honor now. I've been in the role now 10 years, so it's an honor to lead the Reform movement.
No, Jonah, you carry on that torch magnificently, and more and more people really need to know the power of the rack and what it does intergenerationally, because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our kids who've grown up to be leaders in the movement and the Jewish community who, let's say, wet their civil rights, social justice teeth in an experience at the rack.
And their Jewish identity.
Absolutely.
Many young people who come to Judaism from their social justice or civil rights lens through the rack and their experience discover that it's Jewish to care about poverty or homelessness, to care about other humans, and then they reclaim their Jewish identity.
So let's jump to what you alluded to before, because it's the number one question I wanted to ask you. We've just come through this academic year. This isn't over. You were in Harvard, you said, and again, Mazel Tov on your daughter's graduation. What on the ground, what was that like? What feelings bubbled up on you, and what was the reaction in the rack on how to deal with this explosion? And third question, the fact that we had Jewish kids and some colleagues participating in these demonstrations and encampments. Wow.
Yeah, wow is right. I think wow is a good way of kind of describing the cognitive dissonance that we're all feeling. And my wonderful colleague here at the URJ, Yolanda Savage Narva, who is an African-American Jewish woman and a real partner for me in thinking through some of the complexity of what we call Black Jewish relations. She is a Black Jew. So we forget, 15% of the American Jewish community is not white. We have Black Jews, brown Jews, Asian Jews, Jews of all hues. And so the kind of nostalgia of the civil rights era, Kivy Kaplan and Dick Hirsch marching with King, we live in a much more complicated reality. And Yolanda likes to say this is a moment of holding multiple truths. So Richie, let's lay out a bunch of the truths. Number one, what I realized as a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School on October 7th, I was there as of September. But so even before October 7th, we have an antisemitism problem. And there really is a problem. There has taken on a kind of a false narrative of Israel as a settler colonial project, a white supremacist project of Europe. Though there, of course, is truth to the challenges of the founding of the state of Israel, there is what for us is the independence of the Jewish state, the first time of Jewish sovereignty in 2,000 years, despite 2,000 years of praying to return, of living continuously in the land. There was a Nakba, there was a dislocation, there was, so living with multiple truths is appreciating the reality of Palestinian suffering and the reality of Palestinian national self-determination. But what we saw on the campuses, I had seen in the weeks before, which was kind of a taking root in the academy of a presumption that Israel had no legitimate right to exist, that Israel was some kind of modern innovation of nationalism, a white supremacist project. And it's, as you know, Richie, it is ahistoric and intellectually sloppy. And at the same time, I also saw a lot of Jewish and not Jewish young people yearning for facts, truth, deeper understanding. Most young people on college campuses that I was working with care about Israel. They've been, some haven't. They want the Jewish people to be safe both in the US and in Israel, but they want to understand the truth of the occupation. They want to understand the history. And what October 7th, I think, brought on was, on the one hand, the truth that our people were attacked. It was the worst, as you know, the worst pogrom against the Jewish people, and since the Holocaust, on a single day, certainly in our memory and our history. And the feeling of being gaslit that even before the reports had come out of what had happened, already the folks in the name of Palestinian liberation were marching against the Zionist entity. And so we knew we had a problem. And so I think one of the third truth we're carrying is, how do we legitimately criticize the occupation? How do we legitimately criticize the Netanyahu policies, which have been settlement expansion, a coalition with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the most racist regime in the history of the state of Israel, complicit with the people like Baruch Goldstein, who murdered countless innocents, Muslims of prayer, and at the same time defend not just Israel's right to exist and defend itself, but to speak the truth of what happened on October 7th. And I think our college students are navigating those complexities. I know I'm rambling a bit, but let me conclude with this. You asked, how did the Religious Action Center respond? We're trying to hold those truths and say, number one, campuses should be a place of free speech and safety. That means for everybody. So if we're going to say that activists in the name of Palestinian liberation have a right to protest. Jewish students, Zionists, have a right to both speak out and protest, and everybody has to be safe. So there have to be clear codes of conduct. There has to be clarity of what crosses the line that becomes, you can't say fire in a crowded movie theater. At what point is speech turning into harassment, into bullying, into persecution of other people? Do campus policies actually have to be enforced? All of those kinds of issues. And so we've tried to lean into the multiple truths, protecting safety and free speech of all students, protecting our Jewish students, whether they want to wave a Zionist or an Israeli flag, or those Jewish students that are, as you said earlier, in the encampments, and some of our Jewish faculty, Reform Jews who are in the encampments, who are doing it in the name of Jewish liberation for Palestinian people. So it's complicated.
One of our pet peeves has been the fact that we don't teach history in high schools anyway. People don't know history. You alluding to the fact that a lot of our own kids, and we've had this conversation with other rabbis, and I know Ami Hirsch is the last recharging being focused on this. How can the RAC, as a center for social justice in the movement and really in liberal Judaism, teach history so that our kids and our adults who also don't know history can understand that this is just not this is not in a vacuum. It's part of a larger geopolitical restructuring, however you want to call it. Are there conversations in the RAC internally about trying to create sort of like a consultation on conscience around the history of anti-Semitism?
So I want to make you more unhappy before I make you happier. So your audience, I was sitting
Jewish.
with
we start with unhappy and then we...
Exactly. and then let's see.
Exactly right.
So I'm sitting with a very prominent member of the Harvard administration back in, the first weeks, after, and this person's office was being occupied by some Jewish students who were saying, not in our name, ceasefire now. And, this person who's not Jewish, but understands, the history of the conflict, understands the Jewish community, understands, American history, and is a historian by training, said to me, Rabbi, I was sitting with the students, and this is an educator. So he listened and listened and listened and really made space. And then he said to the students, I've listened a lot. Many of the things that you're sharing, I've never read in any scholarly article. I've never seen in a book about the conflict. Is there some book you've been reading you could recommend? Awkward silence. Is there a scholarly article you can advise? Awkward silence. And then one of the students said, well, we can share the TikTok videos that we've been watching. So, Richie, I don't say that just to be provocative. I say, okay, so we have an opportunity, right? We have a generation of young people. This was, by the way, this was Harvard. So, so we have a generation of young people who are an open book, so to speak. I mean, I guess they're an open TikTok. At the RAC, one of the things that I think you alluded earlier, we run the Litaken immersive experience for teenagers, where we bring 3,000 teenagers for 4 days for an intensive to learn first over Shabbat Jewish sources. We do rigorous kind of deep dive into biblical and rabbinic texts that cover everything from immigration to Israel to, bigotry and antisemitism. And then they learn about public policy questions on Sunday. And then on Monday, they go to Capitol Hill and they practice lifting their clear moral voice in the name of Jewish history and tradition and the Reform movement to advocate for policies. And one of the pivots that we realized we had to do is do a much deeper dive around Israel advocacy, and kind of the role in which the RAC is a driver of Zion. And I want to say this clearly, of Zionism. Our founder, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, after he finished as the founding director of the Religious Action Center, moved to Jerusalem. He built the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism. He was one of those who helped found the Israel Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. And Dick Hirsch, Olav Shalom, his memory for a blessing, used to famously say, Zionism is a social justice ideology. I want to underscore that, Richie. Zionism is a social justice ideology. For me, as I study Rabbi Hirsch, as I study Echad Ha'am and Martin Buber, Zionism was about the liberation of the Jewish people in our land after contiguously for 2,000 years praying for a return, our people, some of them living in the land, and then actually being able to act on that because of the modern era, but also the liberation because of being Or L'Goyim, a light into the nation, the liberation of all people everywhere to live freely, including the Palestinian people in their land. So we try and teach our young people a Zionism that is a social justice Zionism, the authenticity of us in our land, but also that says that doesn't mean it comes at the expense of other people, their safety and their liberation as well.
Well, as you said, there are many things can be true at the same time. And
exactly right.
Because we live in a society of silos and polarization, that, as you know, because you're in Washington where it's raised to a high art form, there's very little movement in that sacred middle, which is why the RAC does such a good job. You mentioned, Kivi Cap, and I got to ask you this. So last week I'm reading in one of the newspapers, because I still read newspapers, the NAACP calling for, cutting off, I think it was military aid to Israel because of the horror in Gaza. And I'm literally looking at it and saying, holy expletive deleted, And as you mentioned, Kivi Kaplan, who funded the RAC, the president of the NAACP, you as the executive director of the RAC, how do we begin to square this? What the hell has happened?
Rabbi Sharon Brous in Los Angeles gave a great sermon in the weeks after October 7th when she was seeing the gaslighting of the Jewish community. And she's, by the way, very progressive Zionist. I mean, she's a liberatory Zionist. And she said, at a moment when everybody's losing their mind, don't lose your mind. So Richie, this whole thing about holding multiple narratives, it's so tempting when one of these things happen to get belligerent and strident and kind of freak out on Twitter or make a statement. So this is one of those times. So I sit on the national board of the NAACP. My dear friend, Derek Johnson, released that statement, and I was shocked because the headline said, cessation of all military aid to Israel. So first of all, I took a deep breath, which I invite everybody on the Zoom or on this podcast to do. And I actually read the statement. The statement is much more reasoned and thoughtful and balanced. It lifts up Israel's right to defend itself. It lifts up the plight of the hostages and makes a demand for the return of all hostages. It lifts up the suffering of innocents. It says so many things that we actually as a reform movement agree with. It's a good example, first of all, of the headline and the problem of a tweet, because the assumption was NAA. Now, if people read I wrote a response within a couple of hours. It's on our website. It's in my Twitter feed. What I basically said was, we fundamentally agree with the principles of saving the lives of all innocent civilians, including Israeli hostages and Israelis who were impacted, and ending the war as soon as possible. That said, we're deeply disappointed, especially at a time when Israel is under attack from Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. And I think folks should remember, at this moment, even with everything that's happening in Gaza, there are 150,000 warheads aimed at Israel from Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon that, if they were fired, would create mass casualties on a scale that in the hundreds of thousands, not millions. And so when I called in the NAACP leadership, because I don't like to call out people publicly if I can counsel them in rather than cancel them. And I reminded them that Iron Dome is a missile system that if Israel didn't import the Patriot batteries, the Iron Dome missile systems, the other defensive missile systems, there would be a genocide of Jews in the Holy Land. There is no question about it. And to their credit, NAA realized that. I pointed out publicly, their statement didn't preclude defensive systems. They actually changed the headline on their statement to say offensive missile systems that target civilians. I still don't like it, but I think, again, Richie, it's like, for the people who are listening to this podcast, every one of you, I suspect, has had a moment when your local Black pastor, your local Muslim imam, your local, civil rights organization that you work with has said something that has made you either angry or uncomfortable. And you have a choice. You can either cut them off, publicly shame them, or you can sit down with them and say, if I value this relationship, I need to call you in and make sure you know why this hurts so much. And it doesn't always work. I'm not naive, okay? I'm not a Shangri-La hold hands and sing songs guy. But we don't really have a choice but to try. Because as a minority in this country of 2% of the population, if we don't build the broad interfaith, multiracial relationships that we need on the left and on the right, in the Muslim community, in the Christian community, and the Hindu and Sikh community, then we don't have a chance to survive and to thrive, which is what we need to do.
And the sad thing about it is, and which is why, and thank you for that response, because it underscores the TikTok mentality of, I see something, and I'm a 30-second soundbite on the TikTok or whatever, and I immediately jump without having the opportunity, because there's so few opportunities in the culture right now to actually analyze, think, and have a rational conversation, because everything is knee-jerk reaction. It's like that passage in Pirkei Avot, my favorite passage, in a place where no one is acting like a human being, the Hishtadel Liot Ish, try to act like a human being.
That was the exact text that came up for me, Richie. Like, I guess that Sharon Brous said it in a funnier way, but that's the real teaching, is Hillel. I think it was Hillel. In a place where people are not being a mensch, be a mensch. And by the way, I would urge your followers, the tens of thousands of people who listen to and watch this stuff. No, I'm serious. There's a lot of folks. Thousands. Like, it's tempting to react to something you see in the media and immediately fire off an angry email to your rabbi or to your whatever and say, how about we all model the sacredness in the sacred aging, which is to see the humanity in the other, and then to be curious. By the way, I want to add one other thing that people don't know about me, because I don't share it widely. I actually survived a Hamas bus bombing in 1995. I was a student at Hebrew University. I was a graduate student, and I was taking the number 26 bus every day from Beta Kerem, where I lived, to Mount Scopus. One morning in July, I overslept by about 5 or 8 minutes. I missed my bus. I saw it, heading off up the hill. I waited for the next bus in line. I get on. 20 minutes later, there's a huge boom, an explosion, sirens everywhere. It turns out that the bus that I had missed, dozens of people were killed, hundreds were wounded. Several of my classmates at Hebrew University were murdered on that day. And I say this story because I want your listeners to know I made a decision over the decades that followed that experience to not let Hamas steal my humanity. I will not let Hamas steal my humanity. Even at a moment like this, when the Jewish people and the state of Israel is in an existential war, we have to find a way to have the humanity to mourn the death of every child in Gaza. As much as I defend Israel's right to defend itself, I have to be horrified by the cost of that defense. Otherwise, right. I'm not a human.
Thus, the Pirkei Avot thing.
Amen.
We are speaking with Rabbi Jonah Pesner, the executive director of the Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement, based in Washington, D.C. And again, Jonah, thank you for your time. Kol hakavod to you and the RAC for shining that light of tzedek and tzedakah and righteousness to our community, all across interfaith as well. It's rac.org on the website, and I urge people to look at it. You also, before we get to some sort of like topics, talk just very briefly about the fact that you have these regional, statewide associations. I live in New Jersey. My former congregation, I teach at Kol Ami in Cherry Hill. I have a very, very active group of people involved in RAC, New Jersey. What are these state organizations? How are they organized? Obviously, state by state, but
sure. And the origin of it is we work with Bishop William Barber, who's the lead of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, who kind of march in the footsteps of Martin Luther King. And he's heard me tell the story of the Voting Rights Act being written in our conference room. And he famously, in 2016, when we were launching our first civic engagement voter mobilization, which I'll talk about in a minute, he famously said, "Rabbi Pesner, let me issue a correction, a Talmudic emendation, if you will." He said, the Voting Rights Act was not written in your conference room. It was written in blood in Selma and transcribed in your conference room. And it was a reminder to me that the civil rights movement happened in church basements and synagogue basements, across the country. They happen in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. They don't really happen and in conference rooms in DC. And so when I took over back in 2015, we innovated the launch of 9 RAC states, because we understand how much organizing has to happen on a state and local level, both because you can make real change. If state legislatures are big enough that the policies they pass impacts a lot of people, but they're small enough that you can organize, the 100 congregations across New Jersey to put pressure on the legislature and on Governor Murphy to actually make a change, as we did in New Jersey, where we won the Fair Chance Housing Act, which was a coalition of synagogues, Black churches, other faith institutions, pushing the legislature to remove obstacles to home ownership from returning citizens. So if somebody has served jail time, our thing is, if you've served the time, you've done your time, you don't need to keep paying for the crime. You should be able to buy a house and get a mortgage. And it becomes a double punishment when you get out of jail and then you can't buy a home because you're precluded from checking that box, which says, have you ever committed a felony? That's the kind of example. And by the way, it's good for everybody. You want returning citizens to actually have productive lives, to get jobs, to buy homes, to raise families. So we're in 9 states like New Jersey. The 9 states we're in cover 60% of the American Jewish community, which means we're really mobilizing a Reform Jewish movement to actually have an impact on a state and local level. That said, I want to reassure your many listeners who live outside of our 9 RAC states. Since 2016, 10,000 Reform Jews have mobilized more than 2 million voters in the 18, 20, 22, and now in the 24 elections in a nonpartisan 501c3 appropriate way to make sure that our enduring Jewish values and the way that they impact on policies are part of the discussion in the public square. And we make sure that the Voting Rights Act, which is heart and soul to who we are, which was eviscerated by the Supreme Court in 2013 and Shelby v. Holder, that we say, okay, we're limiting voting rights in certain communities in certain places, but we're going to make sure that every voice is heard because every vote is counted. So everybody can get involved no matter where you live in the reform movement.
So moving forward into the next couple of years, there's so many issues. I'm just going to mention 3, and out of respect for your time,
only 3.
Each one of these is a semester class at least. Question: how is the RAC dealing with these issues? If you can summarize, and immigration, reproductive rights, healthcare, because they're all top of the list issues coming up in the next couple of months.
Right. And so first of all, Richie, thank you for asking. And I just want to make sure people understand when the RAC organizes around these issues, we don't start with the issues. We start with enduring Jewish values and sources, right? So in the case of immigration, we center the fact that 36 different ways, 36 different times in the biblical text, we're taught you were slaves in Egypt and you were freed. Therefore, you should love the stranger. And it doesn't say tolerate the stranger. It says love. And we have the image of Abraham and Sarah rushing out to the migrant, offering them hospitality, food, and nourishment. So, there's a whole body of sources in rabbinic literature about what we're to do with the outsider who comes to dwell among you. That's where our policies, which then are debated and discussed, and policies and resolutions get passed. So it's not Jonah. I don't get to make it up. I inherit the biblical texts, rabbinic tradition, and then URJ resolutions and resolutions by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. You can see, and by the way, this is proof positive. We're nonpartisan. We came out hard last week against the president's executive order on immigration. It looked a lot like the policies of the last administration. So whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, if you kind of pass policies that limit asylum seekers, that prevent the ability for families to be whole and to be united and welcomed in this country, remember, it is not just a matter of Jewish values, it's the law of the land that if someone is a legitimate seeker of asylum, that they get to have their claim adjudicated. And if they are actually a refugee, they get to have refuge here. Unfortunately, the executive order that President Biden issued is going to arbitrarily cap at just over 1,000 people. Once they hit that number of people crossing the border, they stop hearing any asylum cases and they turn people away. It's illegal. It's not just unconscionable. So we're going to be resisting that policy. We're very concerned about the election in either direction because both candidates are running on xenophobia and kind of a hatred of the foreigner and the other, just about abortion care. I think you know better than even I do, and any rabbi on this call, rabbinic literature is very clear on this. There's a whole rabbinic tradition saying the health of the mother, when the lives are at risk, outweighs the life of the potential life. And the reason we do circumcision on the 8th day is because the rabbis understood that until a baby is actually born and alive, it's not a full life in the same way that a mother is. Now, obviously, it's a complicated issue and people have strong feelings about it, but the Reform movement has been on record of protecting a woman's right to make the choice and to determine with her doctor when her life is at risk. And so, we've seen since the Dobbs decision, abortion rights get rolled back in state after state after state. But we also know that when abortion is on the ballot, we can win. And the RAC has been mobilizing voters in a nonpartisan 501c3 appropriate way to organize voters, like in the great state of Ohio, where we just had a double win, both to protect abortion rights, but also to protect democracy, because there was an attempt to raise the threshold for ballot initiatives from 50% of the vote to 60%, which was a cynical ploy by the anti-abortion forces just to try and maintain the anti-abortion legislation that they wanted. So we won that victory. We're seeing all in. Our congregations in Florida are all in a question 4. It's a yes on 4 campaign to make sure that abortion will be codified into law. We've seen victories in Kansas and Massachusetts. Couldn't be more different as states around abortion rights. And then the last issue that you raised is healthcare. Maimonides, one of the great rabbinic scholars of all time, taught that the first thing every city has to do is, or not the first thing, a core thing that every city has to do is make sure that every citizen or every resident has quality, affordable access to healthcare. So we'll continue to make sure that the Affordable Care Act that this movement championed and fought for is protected and preserved and funded. I think the numbers now are that millions and millions have healthcare access that didn't before. So, and
the healthcare thing, look, to our constituency in Jewish Sacred Aging, the AARP crowd this is a real, as I say, kitchen table issue, because it's cost. The inequity of healthcare access in the country is a sin. It's a sin.
I will say at the end of the day, we have a funding problem in this country, which is we don't like to pay for things that we value. And so there is a long-term commitment that the country is going to have to make to actually pay to make sure that the healthcare access that people are getting. I mean, I don't have to tell all of you, every year my premiums go up, my copays go up, my coinsurance goes up, and the amount that's covered goes down. So, and my daughter is in healthcare finance on the nonprofit sector. And she said to me, Daddy, what part of this is nonprofit? We're talking about billions on assets between the insurers, the providers. So we're going to have a big moral conversation about the economics of healthcare. By the way, I know you didn't ask, but I got to say, with all the bans, the trans bans, the book bans, we have an assault on LGBTQIA rights as a community. We have to lead, just as we're going to have to hold multiple truths at once, because our folks are under assault. Our Jews of color, because of racism, our LGBTQIA Jews because of the bans, Jews who need to get abortions, Jews that need healthcare access. So it's not just about helping the other; it's folks in our own community that are struggling with these issues.
Exactly the point. That one of the great sins that we're living with is, depending upon where you are living, you have my granddaughter living in New Jersey has certain rights and freedoms that if she was living in Florida, Texas, Mississippi, or other parts of this country, she would not have. And that is fundamentally wrong. I know I want to get you out of here real quickly. I know you're pressed for time. I know you're very busy. So let me again, thank you, Jonah, for your time. Just one last quick question. The softball question. I'd like to end with a softball question to make an easy exit. How concerned are you, as the head of the Religious Action Center, of Christian nationalism taking over this country?
Honestly, I'm really concerned about it. Right now, the Jewish community is so traumatized by October 7th and the threat that we're seeing both to Israel from Hamas and from the antisemitism in so-called progressive circles. That's all. Okay, so full stop. And the reality of white Christian nationalist America, the violence of it, i.e. Jews will not replace us, synagogue, the Tops Buffalo shooting, which was targeting black people, but in the name of the replacement lie that Jews are in a conspiracy. We are really, so one other quick story before we go as an example of what's possible, because I want to leave your listeners on a hopeful note. So in Texas, which is a very complicated state to live in right now, as you said, different, right? The legislature passed what is clearly being driven by the kind of white Christian nationalist movement. It was a bill that allowed public schools to have ordained ministers serve as school guidance counselors, chaplains as counselors. Now, it might sound fine. It's like, I'm a chaplain. Richie, you may be a chaplain. I would be perfectly fine as a guidance counselor. I wouldn't proselytize. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to get proselytizing chaplains in there to advance an evangelical Christian agenda. There was no way we could resist it on the legislative level. So the RAC, together with our interfaith partners, organized a grassroots movement to go school district by school district to make a demand that school boards refuse to implement this policy and make a public commitment that they wouldn't do it. We won in 90% of all the students of Texas are protected from this bill. So there is a way to, at the grassroots level, be part of the interfaith, multiracial reality of America that will hold this country to be its best, highest self, which is the inclusive democracy in which every person belongs, whether you're a white Jewish Zionist or you are a low-income person of color who is an immigrant to this country. All of us together belong, and we can fight for that multiracial, inclusive possibility.
Jonah, thank you very, very much. RAC.org, rac.org. That's the website to connect. Are you still doing congregational visits? I know post-pandemic, if a congregation wants to, talk to you, bring you to the congregation, are you still doing that, or is things?
Well, one thing I will always do, I will always Zoom into a congregation. I love all my 850 congregations equally, but it's hard. So what I've learned is you'll love this. Rabbi Peter Berg in Atlanta invited me to give the big keynote for their social justice MLK thing. This is the temple that was bombed by the Klan, right? Very famous. And I said, okay, I'm happy to do it. I said, tell me, do you live stream? And he said, yes. I said, so how many people are going to be in the room? He said, about 100. I said, how many people will be on the live stream? He said, about 500. I said, so you want me to fly down there, speak in the room so I can be on a camera talking to your people? I said, so I did it from home. So I'm happy to Zoom anywhere.
No, that's cool. So thank you. Jonah, just take care of yourself. Mazel tov again with graduation, and just stay healthy. That's the most important thing. And blessings on the work that very, very important that you do, not only for the RAC, but for the Reform movement and for the Jewish people in the community. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
It's an honor, Richie. Thank you for what you're doing.
Again, in that healthcare thing, if we can help you, just let me know. To all of you, thank you very, very much for joining us on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Again, if you want to contact us, Jewish Sacred Aging rabbi address at jewishsacredaging.com. Go to the website. There's a very, very conveniently located donate button if you'd like to help support our work in these podcasts. If you just click on that, just follow the directions. It's real easy. And thank you very much for your support. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the broadcast arm of Lubetkin Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And as usual, a shout out to our producer, Steve Lubetkin. Until we meet again, take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And until we see each other again, please be safe. And most of all, be kind to one another. Toda Rabah. Shalom.